So I'll tell you another thing that's right about Kansas is they have in the city of Wichita. Well, Wichita's a great place, and anybody from Wichita here? Yeah, and so you're going to get the joke, and nobody else will. So they have a minor league baseball stadium situated right next to the river, exactly like you guys have here. And you know what? It's the same river. Funny thing is, though, I don't know where you guys got your pronunciation. They pronounce it correctly there, Arkansas River. Anyhow, I didn't come here to talk about what's the matter with Kansas today, but what's the matter with all of us. You know, what's gone wrong in this country. And I want to start with an anecdote from a long time ago, from March of 1868, which was the springtime of American capitalism. And in that month, a young fellow by the name of Jay Gould set off for Albany, New York, carrying with him a suitcase full of cash. Now, Gould, as you all probably know, was one of the most brilliant Wall Street operators of his day. And at that particular moment in 1868, he was struggling with Cornelius Vanderbilt for control of the Erie Railroad. Vanderbilt wanted that railroad. Gould and his friends were holding Vanderbilt off with a strategy that you and I would today call illegal. It involved sort of, massive printing of bonds and all kinds of, fraudulent financial instruments, and yeah. Anyhow, these two legendary capitalists were fighting it out in Albany, New York, and eventually, of course, their fight became a conflict over the law. Each side bought up its own set of judges, and before long, they were up there in Albany, the state capital of New York, fighting it out. And from his hotel room there in Albany, Jay Gould would dispense tens of thousands of dollars to any willing New York state legislator, while Vanderbilt's agents would hand out tens of thousands more. And that was a lot of money in those days. Fabulous stories were told of the amounts which the contending parties were willing to expend, wrote Charles Francis Adams. Never before had the market quotations of votes and influence stood so high. This was the golden age of American capitalism, like I said, and our culture worshipped entrepreneurship. It gloried in the production of millionaires, and it generated these sort of ingenious scientific theories to rationalize the concentration of wealth into the hands of a tiny sliver of the population, right? To tell us why it was that the market's way was God's way. Now, for the rest of the country, of course, crowding into the big cities and the dark satanic mills, it was a golden age of human misery. Unregulated capitalism meant toxic food, dangerous workplaces, grinding poverty, even if you worked hard, massive strikes, and, of course, all manner of clever Wall Street frauds. Now, the logic of entrepreneurship in those days came to dominate politics as well as commerce, and wholesale bribery in the Jay Gould manner was just the beginning of the story. As capitalism became more sophisticated, so too did the political instruments available to money become more and more sophisticated, advancing from simple influence buying to a kind of final integration of business and the state. When a St. Louis reformer declared in the 1890s, this is what he said to Lincoln Steffens, once upon a time a famous reporter, but this guy in St. Louis said to Steffens, "It is good business that causes bad government." He was very close to understanding the entire era in a single sentence. Now, you guys know this. There were plenty of people back in those days who wanted to reform the political system, but it took them an awfully long time to figure out how to do it. They tried things like setting up a nonpartisan civil service, but it was never any use. Political democracy was meaningless as long as money controlled its machinery, as a famous historian once put it. What they found was that the problem was deeper than that. You couldn't root out corruption without bringing capitalism itself to heel. We cannot join economic inequality and political equality, said the theologian Walter Rauschenbusch. You had to solve both problems at the same time, both the immiseration of the workers and the corruption of justice, or you couldn't solve either one. Today, it's like we are learning these lessons all over again. It's no coincidence to me that the principal malefactors in the three great scandals of the last 10 years, by which I mean Enron, Abramoff, and Wall Street, the investment banking industry, that these three culprits, all of them claim to be true believers in the free market. It's not just by chance that you can find on the political right theorists who think that that government has no business outlawing insider trading or price fixing. Theorists who think there's nothing wrong with price gouging or kickbacks. Even theorists who think that bribery, and I'm not making this up, theorists who really do believe that bribery has a righteous role to play, that bribery is just business acting in self-defense against the hated liberal state. In fact, until last September, we were basically living in a kind of version of that same world that Jay Gould was in 100 years ago. Our culture worshipped the billionaire. And up until it all fell apart for the billionaires, but we understood market forces the way our ancestors understood God. Once again, up until last September, the top 1% of the population made as much as the bottom 50% put together. And for almost 30 years, up until last fall, leaders of both of our political parties, with a few exceptions here and there, gushed over the possibilities of entrepreneurial government, of what George W. Bush used to call market-based government. And the instruments that we developed in that period to expose government to market forces, to put government itself up for sale, these would have dazzled Jay Gould. So, what kind of government do we get from a movement that mistrusts government's ability to get things done? Well, the short answer, as we all learned in the Bush years, is lousy government, with health and safety codes gone unenforced, labor law just completely out of the picture, incompetence on kind of a heroic scale, a catastrophic occupation of Iraq, and basically the self-destruction of the deregulated and largely unsupervised financial industry. Governments like our last one routinely appoint industry lobbyists to run the regulatory departments that oversee those industries, and they routinely put people hostile to some particular branch of government, say Social Security or the Legal Services Corporation. They put somebody hostile to that operation's very existence in charge of that operation. They do this all the time. And in fact, examples of it are everywhere. It's not just a matter of banking regulators utterly missing the crisis in bad mortgage debt, or in Alan Greenspan's case, refusing to believe that it was even happening, right? Because it contradicted his entire theory of the world. He could not imagine that it was happening. But that's just part of the pattern. Remember how just last year there was a news story about how the Federal Aviation Administration had come to regard the airlines rather than the public as its customer. This is a common word that you heard in the Bush years. The industry was their customer, and of course they started going easy on the airlines when it came time to inspect their airplanes. Or remember how there was one branch of the Department of the Interior that became so cozy with big oil that they were actually physically getting it on with these guys, right? In Washington, you often hear that regulators are in bed with industry, but usually it's figurative. In this case, it was literal. And there's dozens of examples of stuff like this. Examples of the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Agriculture, the EPA, they go on and on and on. And so what I did in my book, The Wrecking Crew, they've got copies of it over here. You'll see it's got that beautiful cover. In this book, what I did is I set out to survey the extent of the wreckage, to see what conservatism wrought during its years in power. Now, one of the places that the wrecking was most systematic was in the nonpartisan civil service, which is pretty much an essential element of every advanced industrial society. It's something that you and I take for granted. Well, the conservative movement hates and despises it. They call it a permanent government. It's supposed to have this entrenched liberal agenda, and you have to beat the civil servants down with a strong hand, right? And one of the most fascinating things I found while I was doing the research for the book was an interview from 1928, an interview with the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which was then, as it is today, one of the great powers of conservative D.C. And in the interview, the dude made this proclamation: the best public servant is the worst one, okay? The best public servant is the worst one. Think about that. What did he mean by that? Well, what he meant was that talented people had to be kept out of government at all costs. Well, why would you want to do that? Because if you have talented people in government, then government will work. And if government works, then people will consider handing over more and more power to it. And obviously this would be bad for business, not to mention being the first step on the slippery slope to communism. That's right. And this is not just one zany head of the Chamber of Commerce saying this in 1928. This is a theme that you find repeated throughout the history of conservatism, this idea of keeping the best and the brightest out of public service. The ideal public servant, according to the conservative view of things, is a movement loyalist. That's who you want in charge of, say, the SEC or, the panel that makes sure toys are safe, right? A movement loyalist, that's who you want. Now, the most direct statement of this principle comes from Grover Norquist, who I understand is speaking here next week. Is that right? Grover Norquist? No? Okay. That was a joke. Anyhow, he's one of the more brilliant strategists of the Washington right. And this is something that he said in a speech that he gave in 1986, okay, long time ago. He said this: first, we want to remove liberal personnel from the political process. Then, we want to capture those positions of power and influence for conservatives. Stalin taught the importance of this principle. He was running the personnel department while Trotsky was fighting the White Army. So when push came to shove for control of the Soviet Union, Stalin won. His people were in place and Trotsky's were not. With this principle in mind, conservatives must do all they can to make sure that they get jobs in Washington. Now, I'm not going to go on, I'm not going to talk here about how the only real Soviet influence that you find in America is on the political right. Okay, I'm not going to go there right now. I just want to say that it is a short walk from that sentiment of Grover Norquist from 1986. It's a short walk from there to the Bush administration Justice Department, where you found a graduate of Pat Robertson's law school screening potential employees for their views on gay marriage, placing right-wing friendlies in important jobs, and helping to fire 9 far more experienced U.S. attorneys for reasons of insufficient conservatism. Now, since it is a basic principle of the conservative movement, and by which I mean it is an axiom, right? It is a cornerstone. It is an immutable law of human nature that turning over government operations to private businesses is the best and most efficient way to get things done. The ultimate answer to this problem of the civil service is actually really simple. You outsource it, right? You just turn the work over to the private sector. And this is the signature gesture of conservative administrations, handing over public functions to private businesses everywhere from New Orleans to Baghdad, and from the Department of Homeland Security to the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, in reality, of course, the conservatives' outsourcing system turned out to be a ripoff of mammoth proportions. I mean, in each of the Bush administration's signature initiatives, anti-terrorism, right, Homeland Security, the recovery from Katrina, and the administration of Iraq, or the reconstruction of Iraq, I should say, privatized government got a starring role, and in each case, it proved itself to be a gold-plated botch, right? I mean, again and again, and despite a veritable river of dollars, it failed to deliver what was promised. In the Bush years, the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security routinely accepted contracts so poorly written that they seemed to be designed more as a way to sluice billions of dollars into the contractors' pockets than as a device for getting something done. By the way, I'm very pleased to say that President Obama said almost exactly the same thing as me about 1 week ago. It's an amazing thing to hear the President of the United States agreeing with me. I wake up every morning and pinch myself. I can't. Anyhow, once you've outsourced all the work, the question then is, it's all about oversight and accountability. And one of the favorite maneuvers that you find in conservative administrations is shutting down the agencies that are charged with monitoring the outsourced operations. So basically then, there's nobody watching out for it at all, making sure that the money is spent in the right way, but that way the market gets to do its magic without any scrutiny from government at all. Now, once we've figured out this pattern, we can start to see the model extending all across the winger wonderland that is Washington, D.C. Outsource the job, orders the free market ideology, and a contractor is duly chosen. But not just any contractor, and not even the low bidder necessarily. It always, in the Bush years, it always had to be a contractor whose conservative bona fides were well known, right? Who was ready to tithe back a little bit to the movement that gave it to him, who was willing to help build up one of the ideological retirement homes, you know, the think tanks and the lobby firms that would then, and that are today, furnishing our conservative friends with a plush free market sinecure once their days in public service are done, as they thankfully are. Now this, I'm sorry, maybe I'm a little too partisan. For many years I was a registered Republican. Does that surprise you? Yeah. Anyhow, maybe I still am. I mean, back in Johnson County, Kansas, I have no idea. Anyhow, this brings us to the related problem of the revolving door, which is something that we talk about a lot in Washington, D.C., the revolving door in which government workers, and sometimes even elected officials, appear to do these astounding favors for private companies, and then, lo and behold, they go on to take very lucrative jobs at those very same companies once their time in government is over. And there are countless examples of this, but my favorite one remains the people who wrote the Bush administration's prescription drug benefit plan, whom you guys will remember this. The administration plucked from the for-profit medical industry. They wrote the law, and then they immediately went back to the industry from whence they had come as soon as they finished their work, a work that I might remind you is incredibly shoddy from a perspective of we the people, but immensely profitable from the perspective of their once and future employers. And this wasn't just one or two people. This was fully 15 of the public officials charged with crafting that law who left for the greener pastures of Big Pharma once the job was done, including a powerful House committee chairman who became a lobbyist for Big Pharma, where he, to this day, is pulling down over $2 million a year. Now, the last point I want to make, actually, it's not the last point. I'm going to blab on for a long, long time, but I want to make a point about the word conservative itself, this idea of conserving the society that we were all born into. And you'll admit it's an attractive notion, right? Well, think about it. Back in 1965, the year that I came into the world, liberalism was delivering one of the greatest periods of prosperity in American history. In that year, U.S. GNP grew by 6.5%. You compare that to the glory years of the billionaire just ended, and even in those years, you know, in the 2000s, it would barely get over 2%. Okay, and those were considered really good years when it would get up to about 2%. But back in 1965, the country grew at a rate of 6.5%, and this was in line with the official stated goal of American economic policy, a growing abundance widely shared. That was our government that said that. That was the economic policy of this country, a growing abundance widely shared. We were supposed to be the affluent society, remember that? We were the great land of equality. Taxes were high, and the richest man in the world was the oil baron J. Paul Getty, who was worth between $1 and $2 billion and was fond of complaining about how tough it was to be rich, since in those days, meaning 1965, Getty complained, even the middle-class man had access to what once had been the exclusive privileges of great wealth. It was hard to be J. Paul Getty. So it was tough. Okay, and look at us now. Look at us now after almost 30 years of so-called conservative rule. What did these guys conserve? Even when times were good, times sucked. I mean, in the Bush years, productivity galloped along, but since workers' organizations were out of the picture, only the people at the very top of the economy benefited from the advance. In 2007, there was a hedge fund manager that made $3 billion in 1 year, more than J. Paul Getty's entire fortune. And I suppose that was one hell of an accomplishment for us as a society, that we had one more billionaire to be proud of. Hot damn. But think about the cost. Think about what it costs to build us up another billionaire. Sudden outbreaks of deadly food poisoning, train derailments, mine accidents, mysterious workplace diseases that, on investigation, it turns out could have been easily avoided at only a slight expense to management. But all of these things made possible and even made unavoidable by a philosophy of government that regards business as its only important constituent. Now, the greatest cost of all, and I'm sorry, but I write for the Wall Street Journal now, so I have to talk about this stuff. You have to get your vitamins along with all this other stuff. The greatest cost of all, the crowning fiasco of this age of debacles, was economic collapse. That's what conservatives conserved, right? At least Wall Street is still there, right? No. Now, the economic disaster was, I submit, a perfect test of the self-regulating market in which sober assessment of risk was basically suspended and pay-for-performance incentives yielded us up an Everest of worthless derivatives. The second thing that the disaster was a perfect test of was of the conservative state, with each of its trademark features, right? Deregulation, voluntary compliance, this sort of reconfiguration of regulatory agents as servants of industry. Each of these elements of the conservative state put to the test, and each of them found to be as worthless as the mortgage-backed securities moldering in WAMU's basement. First, let's talk about the free market in action. I mean, the innovations that made the housing bubble possible, the now notorious subprime loans, the liar loans that were issued in such fantastic numbers, this was basically done by largely by unregulated institutions. These institutions had all your sort of pay-for-performance incentives, right? The free market, one of these great innovations that they came up with in the 1980s. And this is what fueled the whole rotten business, with bankers handing out iffy loans like candy at a parade, because those loans meant revenue and hence bonuses for those bankers in the here and now. The consequences would be borne down the line by the suckers that bought mortgage-backed securities, and of course, then by all of us. Now, conservative anti-regulatory doctrine, meanwhile, ensured that nobody would interfere. The Federal Reserve, which regulates banks in addition to setting interest rates, declined to intervene despite an explicit warning about risky mortgage practices that Chairman Greenspan received in 2000. In 2003, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is another banking regulator that almost nobody knows about, actually preempted state-level regulatory action against mortgage lenders, against predatory lending. And this happened all over the country. There were states trying to crack down on this stuff, and the Bush administration stepped in and preempted those laws. Then there's my favorite regulatory body, the Office of Thrift Supervision, the OTS, which regulates savings and loans. It used to be called the FSLIC, but you know what happened to them? Okay, we won't go there. Different conservative administration wrecked that outfit. I'm sorry, it's not funny. It's a horrible thing. Anyhow, the OTS regulates or oversaw savings and loans, and it adopted what the Washington Post called an aggressively deregulatory stance during the Bush years. Its director, who was, of course, a big Republican campaign contributor from the banking industry, slashed his own agency's staff and rolled back enforcement. He was so dedicated to deregulation that he once posed for photographers holding a chainsaw to a pile of rule books and red tape, right? You got to cut through that red tape. That's what you need to do. And naturally, and like all the other Bush-era regulatory agencies that we've been discussing, the OTS thought of the industry that it oversaw as its customers, and that's the word they used for them. That was their customers. Now, the next step in the death dance was the packaging up of all those iffy mortgages into investment-grade securities, the toxic assets that were then greedily wolfed down by the banks and the pension funds and the insurance companies and all the other soon-to-be casualties of the financial crisis. Well, why did these savvy players fall for this stuff? You ever think about this? For one thing, because the incentives told them to, right? The more rubbish that they bought, the greater their bonuses would be. Dealing with a disaster would be somebody else's problem down the line. And for another, there's no supervisors, no regulators to stop them or to slow them down. Wall Street was, after all, this was the scene of conservatism's greatest deregulatory victories. And over the years, Washington's various right-minded leaders had basically all agreed that securities markets, if you just let them alone, they were self-regulating. Everything would be fine. Oversight just got in the way and prevented all that, that wonderful freewheeling entrepreneurship on which our prosperity depended. And because everybody in Washington basically agreed on this point, our regulatory agencies atrophied over the years, becoming in many cases adjuncts of the industries that they were supposed to be regulating. And that's why the mortgage-backed securities, and then a little later on, the credit default swaps, when their turn came to wreck the world, these things were traded in completely unregulated markets. Now, there was an agency in Washington that was supposed to be looking after this stuff. It was called the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. But this was, for conservative administrations, basically a favorite parking lot for free market zealots, these individuals who are singularly indifferent to the regulatory mission. But when a couple years back, in 1998, you had one head of this regulatory agency who thought different and suggested that these dark markets should be regulated. They needed a little bright light. She was instantly slapped down by a righteous and bipartisan market-celebrating team consisting of Greenspan, Treasury Secretary Bob Rubin, and Rubin's lieutenant, Larry Summers. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which is what most of us are counting on to keep an eye on the boys on Wall Street, was no better. I mean, it was chronically understaffed, underfunded, and it mainly, the main reason it even exists anymore is to serve as a kind of rung on the ladder of Wall Street success, right? A place where a young person moving up in the world spends a couple years before they go on into the securities industry. And even so, for conservative administrations, it was a standing offense, right? The SEC, they hated it. And so they would always fill it with these veterans of the firms that the SEC was supposed to be regulating, who would always say the same thing. They want, a less adversarial relationship with the securities industry. They want a more voluntary approach to supervision. And then one fine day in September, the various employees of the SEC woke up to find that they had no industry left to regulate. It was all gone. All the investment banks had gone out of business or else reclassified themselves as something else. What they did have was a collapsing stock market, foreclosures across the country, spiking unemployment, even unemployment on Wall Street. And so the wrecking crew did its work, and the fruits of their labor surround us today. I mean, just as it did every few years back before the regulatory state began. We're back to that, to square one again, back to Jay Gould's time. And one of the things about those days is that you had an epidemic of public theft that would persist despite having a long string of reformers in the White House. You'd have Republicans after Democrats after Republicans, each of them promising to clean the place up. But nothing worked. Nothing ever worked, and for this simple reason, because democracy cannot work when wealth is distributed as lopsidedly as theirs was then and as ours is again today. The consequence of plutocracy then and now is bought government. As Justice Brandeis said at the time, we can have democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. It's a bitter decision that we're going to have to make all over again. Thank you very much for listening to my words of cheer.
Thank you. Thank you. Nope, test, there we go. Thank you very much. Another round of applause for our speaker tonight. Great. Let's take some questions. Anyone have questions? Sir.
No stock tips. I won't give stock tips.
You've given us a real good review of history. What does your crystal ball say?
Say that again. What does my crystal ball say? Run for the hills? No, I don't know. I wish I knew these days. There was a time when I was fairly certain about what was going to happen in the future, but I'm not anymore. I'm so caught up in the same thing that everybody else in this room is. I mean, it's terrible times. I've lost all sorts of money. I'm worried about the dollar. I worry about everything. I have gold coins. I want to sell them. I'm not worrying as much. I should say I worried a little more. I'm sorry. This is my digressive style. I just wander off. You asked me about something very specific. I'm just wandering away. I worried more when Katrina hit New Orleans. I remember another disaster of our time, of recent years. And I remember after that, when it finally dawned on me what had gone wrong. I was at the State Fair in Maryland. I was at the Maryland State Fair. I was watching my little girl on one of those really rickety State Fair roller coasters, and she was like 4 or something, and I was like, this is, and it occurred to me that we had spent all these billions and billions of dollars on, homeland security, disaster preparedness, billions and billions of dollars, and we couldn't figure out that a hurricane was bearing down on New Orleans. We couldn't do anything about it, and then that's when it occurred to me that it was like, what a dangerous place the world has become, and that I had to start taking extraordinary precautions, to save myself. I don't know. I got my little girl off that roller coaster, and I went home and bought a survival kit or something like that. I don't know. It's an awful time, and I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know where things are going. You also shouldn't ask me because I'm a born pessimist. I'm just the way I am. I mean, I tell jokes and and all that sort of thing, but I just naturally look on the glass is always half empty.
All right. Next question. We'll go right here.
In a way, my question is a variation on his question, and it has to do with the prescription of getting us out of this. And I'm wondering if you find the root cause for this kind of behavior in convenience and human nature, sort of like little kids dividing the cookie. If I can divide the cookie with nobody watching, so is it a problem of accountability and wake up the people, the public, a problem of numbers and, the majority, or is it human nature?
Oh, well, that's a big question there. Well, first of all, I should say I'm very happy with President Obama. I mean, this is going to strike you as very peculiar. First president I've been really happy about since Ronald Reagan. That's because I was a different person then. I was a 15-year-old right-winger, and I loved Ronald Reagan. I thought he was the greatest thing in the world. And that's why I'm able to write about these guys, because I can understand that mindset. But I think Obama is fantastic, and I think he's been just hitting home runs since day one. I think there's a few things he should be doing a little differently. I mean, we're in this terrible crisis. They've got to come down a lot harder, more decisively on the question of zombie banks. They've got to do something about that. And but basically, I think he is trying his best, and he's got the best people advising him. He also, look, all the problems, when I wrote The Wrecking Crew, the problems I thought that the problems were pretty insurmountable, that Obama was going to have to remake government from top to bottom. He was going to have to totally bring in all new people. He was going to have to make a government career into an exciting, option for young people, all that sort of thing. And another thing, I thought he was going to have to review contracting rules. Remember I talked about all the contracting out that's going on. It's a big part of the problem in Washington. Well, he announced that he was doing that last week. Didn't even make the front page. I don't think it made the front page of any newspaper. They are reviewing all the Bush administration's contracting policies. It's a great day. And it's just, it all pales besides this, fantastic tailspin that we're in, this disaster that we're in. Now, about human nature, the level of voters and the level of the people that, the malefactors, I don't know. I tend to let the Wall Street people off the hook. You might not think, if you read my columns, I make fun of these guys a lot. The captains of the universe, or whatever the hell they're called. What were the masters of the universe, and how silly they are, and the absurd things that they buy, and the way they behave themselves. They're ridiculous. But I don't think that they're unusually greedy people. I think that everybody is probably, there's an equal amount of greed everywhere in the world. Just these guys figured out a way to get whatever they wanted, and to just to steal whatever they wanted from the world. The thing was that you have to have oversight. You have to have balancing forces. This is the way society works. Every other Western country is like this. They have, it's not just the Western countries. You think about India, for example, is putting us to shame these days because they had a properly regulated banking system. None of their banks are going under. They're not having a crisis. They're having a real estate crisis, but they're not having a problem of zombie banks. That's just us. and the Europeans, of course, who are doing exactly what we were doing. So I don't think that human nature is different there. As for voters, you also mentioned, I bet you never thought you'd get such an earful from such a nice, polite question. Voters, one of the things that I wrote about in What's the Matter with Kansas is the way that the culture war issues drag you into this kind of false populism, where it's, conservatives are the friend of the little guy in his war with the high and the mighty. And it's a very, very powerful way of looking at the world. But it's extremely vulnerable to economic collapse, just like my stock portfolio was. That whole way of looking at the world has just dried up and blown away. It's just disappeared overnight. It's become, it's like it's a laughingstock. It's a joke. To think about those culture war issues and how exercised people got about them as recently as 2 or 3 years ago. And now it just doesn't matter. I mean, I know culture war people back home in Kansas, people who would never vote for a liberal, who cursed liberals, where the word liberal was like something you yelled at somebody in the street when you really hated them, voted for Obama. Yeah, they've just had enough of this, Okay.
Who else? Let's go right here. Mr. Do you have someone over there next?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm curious what the roots of conservatism is. I mean, I'm assuming that there were conservatives back during the founding days of the founding fathers. They may have been called something else, but did it take marriage with capitalism in the mid-1800s to change conservatism into something else? Was it? Do you know what the nexus is there?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part of that.
Hold your mic up a little closer.
Do you know what the nexus is as far as the origins of conservatism?
Oh, yeah, sure.
As far as...
Well, conservatism in America, this is an interesting thing. It's a very good question because, this is an ugly, dark secret, is that, cultural conservatism has always been kind of attractive to me. I kind of like the world I was born into, I kind of like it when things... When we pay respect to the past. I mean, I got a PhD in history. Look at the clothes I'm wearing. I like that aspect, that idea, the sort of abstract, the Edmund Burke idea of conservatism is attractive to me. But conservatism in America or T.S. Eliot, another good example. Conservatism in America has never been about that. Conservatism in America is about business, the needs of business. It's always been about that. Its doctrine is laissez-faire. It's not the British, conservatism where you have this, mystical bond with the past. It's not like that in this country. There is no more destructive, overturner of tradition than capitalism. They call it creative destruction. Who was I just reading about this the other day? Oh, hell, I forget. I should have eaten today. I wouldn't forget things so easily. But someone's celebrating creative destruction and how we have to let capitalism wreck everything and then start all over again. And it's like, my God, that's not conservative. That's deeply radical. But in America, we've never really had that kind of conservative tradition of cultural conservatism. And by the way, cultural conservatism, the economic ramifications of that idea tend to be pretty left-wing. Just saying. Who is it? Is it Daniel Bell that says he's a cultural conservative and an economic socialist? There's something we're thinking about there.
Great. Right back here.
I teach AP government. I was wondering to know, when did the regulatory function begin to malfunction? Was this part of the Reagan era, or does this go back earlier than that?
Well, you've got one of the things that you find in the history of regulation is deliberate attempts to sabotage agencies, and that goes back to the very, very beginning. The first regulatory agency in this country was called the Interstate Commerce Commission, set up to regulate railroads, and President Cleveland put in charge of it a guy who had been a railroad attorney. And he was a very conservative railroad attorney, and he wrote a famous letter to his boss. They made him the Attorney General of the U.S., and he had just been, I forget what he had been waging some legal battle on behalf of the railroads, and they put him in charge of the, of the Justice Department, and he wrote a famous letter to his boss, asking his boss what they should do, and the boss wrote back, well, let's kill the ICC. Let's get rid of that. They just set it up, let's kill it. And he wrote back to his boss, he said, that's not a good idea. The wise thing to do is to use the ICC for our own purposes. The first regulatory body, this is just like a few years after it had been launched, we're going to take it over, and then the public will think that they're safe, right? They'll think that somebody's looking out for them, but in fact, we will control it. And he said this in a letter that's, in the public record. And this has been the strategy all along when you get conservative administrations. Then you had, after that, you had the great reform movement in the early 20th century. And then you had some very capable people running the regulatory agencies. But then the conservatives came back in the 20s. And you saw the exact same thing as you saw under the Bush administration. People from industry put in charge of the regulatory bodies. The worst was obviously under President Reagan, when they were doing it almost just as a way of insulting liberals, to say, look, we're in charge, James Watt is running the Department of the Interior, right? Or I forget who they put at OSHA, but Reagan hated OSHA above hell. So did I when I was 15. Hey, and I didn't even know what it was. It's just, Paul Harvey on the radio was talking about how bad it was, and anyhow, I knew to hate OSHA. And they put some dude in charge of OSHA who had been fighting OSHA for years, and they put someone in at EPA. You know these stories, and then they all went home when Clinton came in. Bush came in. They brought them all back. They put in one of James Watt's underlings at the Department of the Interior again. The same people. And it's also, you deregulate, you take the supervision away, and history tends to repeat itself. So you do away with what we used to call in the 90s the Depression-era regulations that we put on the financial industry, and lo and behold, the Wall Street operators start doing the same things all over again. Of course they do, They're allowed to. If you don't stop them, that's what capitalism does. That's the way it behaves. And you also see repeats like the savings and loan disaster in the 1980s. The exact same behavior as a lot of these, the mortgage lenders, the shady mortgage lenders in the last couple of years. And with the same ramifications. This huge losses that the public then has to swallow. In that case, it was $500 billion. I mean, we've blown by that number a long time since with this crisis. Yes? That's right. That's right. Make the shareholders pay. Well, that's right. Look, the thing is that the people who made the mistakes, the question is, why not make the people that made the mistakes suffer the consequences? They ought to, of course, they ought to suffer something. The problem is that the way our system is set up, this is another genius idea of conservatism back in the 1980s, was to reconfigure the corporation. This is a debate you probably don't know anything about and don't want to know anything about, but back in the 60s, corporations didn't really give a damn about their shareholders. Did you know this? The John Kenneth Galbraith thing? They just didn't care, right? The shareholder was vestigial. The CEO worked for different purposes, right? And in the 1980s, the great geniuses of American capitalism looked at that system and said, that's got to change. We have to align the interests of management with the interests of the shareholder. We have to force them to deliver shareholder value. How do we do that? Stock options, performance bonuses. Okay, and then a bunch of other things like leveraged buyouts and other great ideas like that. All of these things have been just fantastic, thudding disaster. I mean, every single one of them pay for performance. So these guys get performance bonuses based on what kind of income that they book for the firm. Well, it turns out, so mortgages turn out to be this perfect thing because they can sell these mortgages to people that don't know any better. This is sort of what WAMU is doing. Sell all these mortgages, these really, really risky mortgages, book all sorts of income that looks really great on paper, package it up, sell it off as mortgage-backed securities. The mortgages go bust 5 years later, but hey, you're out the door. These people don't stay at these firms very long. You've long since collected the bonus and spent it on a $300,000 stereo or something like that, or a mansion in Aspen or something like that, And so the incentives let these people off the hook. The thing is, you can do these things, in capitalism, but you have to have very strong supervision at the same time. And you have to have all sorts of accountability and all sorts of penalties and that sort of thing. We took all that away, even while we were turning this machine, putting the pedal to the metal on the financial machine. Oh, don't get me started.
We're going to go right here. One more question after this.
From something nice like flag burning or something. What do you think about flag burning?
I listen to a pretty good assortment of media, and the screaming heads on the right and NPR.
Yeah.
Mostly, but the right side's always claiming there's going to be socialist or we're becoming a communist state. Your ending statement there about plutocracy seems a realistic sort of view that I have to agree with when so many people are
It
getting
was
so
realistic
rich.
till a little while ago.
So you think that it's going to be halted and better
Well,
distribution? And
you finished the question. I'll tell you in a
I
second.
think you got it suggested. Go ahead.
Okay, the question is what's going to happen with wealth distribution? Stock market crashes are, this is one of those periods where wealth gets distributed the other way. I mean, it doesn't really get distributed. The people that had all that paper wealth is disappearing. I mean, you have former billionaires all over the place now. But I think that their power is still very great. And I think that Obama is going to, in some ways, you're seeing a replay of the early years of the Roosevelt administration where he was swept in 1932 by people from all walks of life, rich and poor, unionized workers and masters of Wall Street. Everybody liked Roosevelt at the beginning. But by 1936, the battle lines had sort of solidified. And Roosevelt was the president of the working class, and the very wealthy people and the bankers and the plutocracy hated him. And I think that'll probably happen to Obama as well. I think what's funny is that Obama certainly doesn't intend that to happen. He wants to, that post-partisan stuff, I think he believes it. I think he really wants to be the president for everybody, It's a nice dream. I think that's not the way history is going to work out.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Isn't it possible that there's a bright side to all the boomer retirements? Roosevelt came in and brought in with him a wave of idealistic, committed, intelligent, competent people. Isn't it possible that with all these boomer retirements in the civil service that this might create openings for Obama and the people working with him to remake our civil service into something competent as opposed to what we have now?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point. And the other thing about Obama is that he's very inspiring. And that's something that people respond to. Now, the problem is that you can't, I've lived in D.C. for 5 years now, and we all know civil servants. We all deal with these guys. You can't get the very best people to do a job when, living in that same city. Look, I live in the same neighborhood as a lot of civil servants, and the reward that you get for working your entire life at the Environmental Protection Agency or whatever, Department of Labor, I don't know, is you get a little brick cube. You've been to Washington, D.C., you've seen these with a garage that's barely wide enough, that's designed to fit a Model A. That's what you get. That's your winnings, right? Whereas, and the ending salary for a D.C., for a career civil servant in the District of Columbia, I forget what it is, but in the Wrecking Crew, this is all in there. I compared it to beginning salaries at some of the big law firms in Washington, D.C. A beginning lawyer, fresh out of law school in Washington, earns more than someone that's that's ready to retire from the civil service in Washington, D.C. right now. That's how screwed up the system is. They call that the pay gap. These are structural things that Obama is going to have to fix. Now, it's hard to fix something like that when you're trying to save money at every turn. I understand that he's got all sorts of problems, but you can't just go on charisma forever. But nevertheless, yeah, this is exactly the moment. The entire country, I think, understands what I was saying in the Wrecking Crew now, that this is, you can't just let the government go forever. You can't just turn off the supervision and fill the departments with people that don't care about the mission or people that are hostile to the mission. You can't do that and expect society to work. The gears seize up. You have to pay attention to the federal government and who's working for it. You have to make sure that it's quality. You have to keep an eye on it so that it can keep an eye on you. And I think that's very clear now. This is the moment when that has to be done. And I think Obama will surely do something like that.
Okay, we'll take one last question. This lady here. I just want to say that...
Todd, you've taken them all from this side
I'm just about to say that if we were in the dean's class, this side of the room would fail. You would be in big trouble. So you have a question? We're going to hold... She's saving your side. We're going to go with this lady right here, and then we'll come back to you. Ma'am, did you have a question? Oh, she said she's passing it for you. There you go. Right up there.
That's what they call a left-wing bias, isn't it? I guess it's right-wing bias from your perspective.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, President Obama, in his recent address to Congress, said that there would be no more corporate tax breaks for those corporations that are outsourcing American jobs and sending them to China and to India. My question to you is that, and man, I'm hopeful for this man, so I'm very supportive, is that enough to give corporations a major incentive to put Americans back in those positions in this country?
Well, I mean, we'll have to see. That's, generally speaking, tiny little variations in the tax code are sufficient to get corporations to change their behavior, and individuals. You know, this is something that social scientists have proven again and again and again. But in that kind of a situation, when they save so much money, you guys know the reason why they send all the jobs over there, because of course the labor is so very, very, very cheap there. And you know, they work with the government. They don't have to deal with labor unions and all that sort of thing. And you know, they can beat up workers with. I'm sorry, I'm going too far. But but those are huge you know, things to counterweights to little tiny variations in the tax code. So I mean, we'll have to see. I don't. That's something that's going to be, you know, very, very particular. I don't know. That's something I wish I had looked into a little bit more for the book, was when the sending jobs overseas really began, because that's another thing that started in the 1980s. It was another way to bring the corporation to heel, you know, to crack down on the labor situation. Oh, that's a depressing subject. This is another thing I write about all the time, is labor. I'm one of the only, in fact, I am the only guy on the Wall Street Journal's opinion page that's very, very, very pro-union. I'm sorry, that's not a popular thing to be in Arkansas, is it? But well, thank you very much. On that
Ladies and
note,
gentlemen, let's thank Thomas Frank.